Good morning, everybody. I'm hoping that you can all hear me. It's all a little bit strange to be so disembodied in this way, but a big welcome and well, a big hello from a crispy spring morning in Cape Town. And it's really good to be with you all this morning. Thank you originally for Eric, Marianne, and the European Sexual Medicine Network for inviting Deirdre and myself this morning. Just briefly, I'm going to start with a more macro view of challenges and opportunities in sexual medicine in South Africa. And then Deirdre is going to speak more about curricula and their integration into the clinical training platforms in South African universities. So without further ado, the agenda, what I'm going to be covering in my portion, I'm going to touch very briefly on socioeconomics of South Africa, something of the sexual health social markers, and then ask the question, what is sexual medicine in South Africa? What does it mean? And talk a little about the rather rocky and uncertain road to becoming a sexologist or sexual health specialist in South Africa. Then further onto the topography of sexual medicine in South Africa, focusing on key areas of interest, the Southern African Sexual Health Association, and a snapshot of undergraduate education at the University of Cape Town. Then speaking very specifically about some challenges and opportunities that we very specifically face. So this over here really exemplifies the theme that will run through the talks that we give and really runs through any time we speak about health in South Africa, the disparities between the haves and the have-nots, the resourced and the poorly resourced. You can't get away from it. We have 60 million persons in South Africa. We have the dubious distinction of being number one in the world with a Gini coefficient of 0.65. And in 2021, during the pandemic, we reached an unemployment record of 32.6%, which means that about 11 million citizens live on less than 28 rands a day, which equilibrates to 1.93 American dollars a day. In 2014, just as some indication of burden of HIV disease, we had 17% of the global HIV burden, though 0.7% of the world's population. And when it comes to the distribution of health services, 84% of the population find themselves served by the state sector and 16% in the private sector. In 2015-2016, just to put that into further perspective, the private healthcare took up 4.4% of the GDP, whereas public spend was 4.1% of GDP. And to counter this disequilibrium, there are plans for a national health insurance well underway, but limited by a number of expected obstacles, social, financial, political. These are just a very small number of social health, sexual health social markers on issues particularly pertinent to a South African context: gender-based violence, some numbers from 2019 and 2020, 53,293 sexual offenses reported. That's 146 per day. And of these, 42,289 were rapes. And of course, this is really the tip of the iceberg, only recorded incidents. HIV prevalence in 2019 is 19.1%, increased from 13.2%. And with regards to STIs, last reliable figures between the ages of 15 and 49 in 2017, syphilis, gonorrhea, and chlamydia, you can see what the numbers are between female and male prevalence: 0.5 and 0.97 for syphilis, 6.6 and 3.5 for gonorrhea, and chlamydia 14.7 and 6%, with WHO 2012 global estimates in comparison. Of course, these are just the tip of the iceberg and also just indicators. Statistics hide so many other realities not appropriate to be spoken about today. So this slide is important because within the South African context, with regards to the needs and the orientation towards social and sexual justice, the issues which confront populations overwhelmingly are centered around needs of populations, needs taken care of by sexual and reproductive health care issues. And the NGO sector is well developed, often but not as well resourced as we and they would like, and take care of things like reproductive healthcare, HIV, STIs, trans and gender diverse healthcare, increasingly gender-based violence. These are really preoccupations, and they take up a lot of the conversations and really dominate the playing field, which means that sexual medicine, which is to say the care of individuals, maybe families, with regards to their sexual function, and the focus on that is often competing for attention. And where they do get attention, if we look to see medical specialities, and it'll become a little clear later on in the presentation where they're represented, but those usual specialities of gynecology, urology, psychiatry, family medicine, fragmented and found really not in a particularly integrated way. And then that last line, private versus state sector, is just that theme to keep in mind as there's this tension between the two running through society and exemplified also in this talk. So how do I become a sexologist? Well, that's also a sexual medicine practitioner or somebody who wants a career in sexual health and to become an expert in this area. And that is very, very difficult, and something that that I certainly hear this question very often. Important to understand, South Africa is historically a very sexually repressed and conservative society with a very strong religious and traditional core value system, which was further entrenched by apartheid South Africa and what are perceived as traditional African values. We have no formal postgraduate sexology or sexual health qualification. There is a very popular diploma in postgraduate HIV medicine, but that really is about infectious disease more than specifically the sexual medicine that we are focusing on in this talk. There's a defunct postgrad diploma, which has some element of sexual medicine in it, but more on that a little bit later. No formal departments of sexual medicine, very few expert clinical practitioners working full-time in sexual health, and no official registration body which takes care of sexual medicine. So how do you become somebody who's expert in sexual medicine? What can you do? Well, you first have to get any clinical degree, medical, psychological, physiotherapy. You get your post-grad training, often overseas, and then you utilize your networks and informal forms of education, and in a sense, fly by the seat of your pants. So if you can see very lightly in the background there, these islands loosely connected to each other by bodies of water. I think a very good metaphor for how we find the topography of sexual medicine in South Africa. And this really comes at it from lots of different angles, starting with the state sector on the right side of the slide. And I would have to also mention that the state is responsible fundamentally for all qualifications, for training, and is the biggest sector and the dominant sector. But insofar as they are with regards to sexual medicine and really most forms of healthcare, but in particular, we're talking of sexual medicine, very sporadic and very poorly resourced. There is, as one example, the Groote Schuur, the main training hospital in Cape Town, has a well-established transgender unit, but the waiting lists are unbelievably long and really cannot meet the need. The Groote Schuur Sexual Health and Medicine Clinic has a 2-hour clinic run by a part-time clinician who's only able to be there because she is funded by grants for other reasons, and really a very tenuous situation. We find it in tertiary education, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. Then there's in the private sector, which is an interesting space because it caters to a much smaller area of the population. But I'm going to just very briefly touch on four areas. My sexual health and sexology courses is one area in the private sector, and the men's sexual clinic is another, Health for Men and the Academy of Sexology. So what are these four? These are four areas which have flourished in the entrepreneurial, slightly less, you could call it freer, open, and better financed area, which is given space by virtue of the fact that there's so little within the state sector. My sexual health and sexology courses is really an example of an exceptionally well-organized, multidisciplinary orientated membership model where it is fee-based, but nevertheless really emphasizes education, supervision, access to high-quality learning materials, and really is exemplary of medical education, but unfortunately serves a very limited amount of people, and you really only access that within the private sector. This just gives you three examples, really also giving the diversity of the different responses in this entrepreneurial space. Men's Health International, which is a franchise, people go there for erectile dysfunction, and they often have, there's often commercial interests which drive the nature of the kinds of treatments, really working on a franchise basis. Health for Men, a little defunct at the moment because finances from ANOVA have dried up. And the Academy of Sexology, a highly distributable academy, which also flourishes by virtue of the fact that it's able to advertising a lot of very dubious educational programs and making a number of false promises to people who find themselves at a loose end once they have somewhat useless degrees. The Southern African Sexual Health Association is worthwhile mentioning because this is one of the places that flourishes in between the private and the public sector, and is an organization which is for professionals, dedicated to professionals to help educate in sexual medicine. It takes up a lot of the slack. It was founded in 1992, and it's interesting to note the genesis of its founding insofar as it really came about with a large amount of money given by Pfizer on the back of Viagra being released in South Africa. Interestingly enough, when it was first introduced, it just was not being taken up very much, and doctors were having difficulty in getting men to present even for ED, a reflection of the conservative background of South Africa. So a large educational drive targeted at GPs was initiated by Pfizer, and this involved getting a whole lot of founding members towards organizing the Southern African Sexual Health Association. No established academics in South Africa meant that these were an eclectic group who had gone overseas, and I'm sure you all recognize some of the names here of places who are iconic in sexual medicine training, and they brought their interests and then started introducing and educating GPs around South Africa. That's the Introduction to Sexual Health on the right-hand side, which they showed. So it then kind of became quite quiet, SASHA. It's been somewhat reinvigorated in the last number of years. I don't have to go through most of this, except to say that we are an executive committee. I've been the president for the last 2 years, giving way now to a new president. We rotate on a 2-yearly basis. Just an idea, even though we have a few members at 183, which relatively speaking is quite a lot, and you see the distribution who makes up that membership, we nevertheless have large footprints on our webinars, of which we had in 2020, 2021, 6 and 7 respectively, quite successful webinars on the back also of the fortunate ability to co-host the 25th WAS Congress in Cape Town just a few months ago. But we have many, many challenges, and these are the challenges first faced throughout South Africa. The hardworking members are volunteers. They give of their time freely. There's the tension between the activism for those social justice causes mentioned previously and the focus on clinical, more dispassionate, objective, and scientific-based type activities. There's issues of diversity, who we're reaching and who we are, funding, having an adequate footprint throughout South Africa, and trying to avoid being too exclusive and being sustainable by virtue of this. So many, many different kinds of challenges that we face. Within the medical school environment, we have 10 medical schools altogether, the newest being the Nelson Mandela University Medical School. This is to serve a population of 60 million in the population altogether. We have approximately 1,200 to 1,300 new graduates an annum, but this is excluding the 10th university, the newest university. It's also excluding a large amount of imported Cuban doctors who come into often rural areas to take up the slack where doctors are just not available. So this slide over here really is meant to show a little bit about the distribution of who, what, and how often and for how long sexual medicine orientated teaching is happening at the University of Cape Town, which has to be one of the more progressive universities within South Africa. And you can see in red the different departments. Anthropology department, interestingly, having the lion's share of the early lectures and contact with a critical health humanities, explaining and going through their topics, comprising power, privilege, intersecting identities, often dealing with gender, sexual, marginalized identities, a lot of sensitization to power issues, which, as you can imagine, are very pertinent in a South African situation, but nevertheless not run by clinicians or doctors. This leads way to family medicine departments taking care of clinical sexual health in second year, and then the Department of Gynecology gives a number of hours of teaching with gynecologists and also specialist sexologists who deal with basic clinical elements of sexual health, workshops on intimate partner violence and forensics and how to deal with rape, as well as a trans and gender diverse healthcare section. So quite diverse on the face of it, very good. But what's interesting is that none of these people speak to each other. And in fact, when I spoke to each of them in turn as preparation for this, to be able to just see what the commonalities were, it was interesting that nobody knew what everybody else was doing. So what are our current challenges? This is the product of discussions I had in the weeks up to this point, where I phoned and spoke to people around South Africa involved with setting up curricula and going through them. Firstly, there's still the challenge that sexual medicine is strongly identified with reproductive healthcare, STIs and contraception, not necessarily sexuality or sexual dysfunction. There are no formal teaching. Finding teachers and qualified teachers is exceptionally difficult, and there's no departments of sexual medicine, though there is a new endeavor at the University of Stellenbosch, which Deirdre will talk about a little bit later. Individuals with special interest and champions often take the classes, which makes them interesting, and these are exemplary individuals who are very much committed to the topic, but when they leave or they are unable to fulfill their roles, they often leave gaping gaps in curricula, in teaching. So there's no or few academic leads, there's little incentive, and there's negligible integration within the different subspecialties in which sexual medicine is important. So they're siloed. Sexual medicine is siloed in different departments, orientated to their specialities with no longitudinal sexual medicine thread going through medical training. And often the curriculum builders that I spoke to were a bit bewildered by my questions on these things, thinking, I hadn't thought of that. Or yes, we still need to get to that. Or hold on, we just haven't got time for that. Other priorities crowding out, notably with full curricula and competition between specialities. So the challenges, limited or no resources in the public sector with regards to teaching resources, but also basic things like KY jelly, PDE5 inhibitors. That means within state sector, you can't treat somebody who is having erectile dysfunction. And as a result, there's less access of students to these problems within dedicated clinics. The clinics and the clinicians have tenuous continuity with each other. And then there's the general and basic challenges involved with setting exams for sexual medicine, the difficulties of creating clear competencies, and the technically challenging element of often engaging with vulnerable students, increasingly vulnerable students we're finding at the younger ages in the medical schools. And of course, turf protection among specialities who protect the boundaries of their specialities within universities with quite a lot of vigor. But some opportunities after that relatively bleak background, and things are changing. What's changing? Well, the student sociocultural and personal milieu is changing dramatically, and this is a global phenomenon. The students are highly sensitized to gender and sexual identity issues. And in fact, this may be the contemporary Viagra of the moment in terms of its reinvigoration of interest in sexual medicine. But there's advantages and disadvantages to this. In fact, it may prove a challenge as the orientation of interest swings towards issues of identity and gender, and not so much within that of traditional sexual medicine in terms of how we've understood it. Well, these are challenges, not necessarily negativities. And there's many examples of these. A lot of vocal questioning of language, attitudes, and norms, which I'm sure we're all experiencing. What is good to see is that pleasure and health and well-being is being actively and increasingly utilized rather than pathologization as entry points to teaching and understanding sexuality. And in South Africa, we're working on the first postgraduate diploma in sexual health and HIV, mostly sexual health. And this is the first of its type in SA, will be the first postgraduate qualification. We also are in discussion at the moment of a spin-off from the African Journal of Primary Care and Family Medicine and looking towards establishing an African Journal of Sexual Medicine. We also have in the main South African Manual of Family Medicine a new chapter in taking a sexual history. And we are doing research in undergraduate perceptions of sexual medicine study under the SHEP study, something that Deirdre has led and knows somewhat more about. So some conclusions. The requirement is there to professionalize and consolidate the discipline of sexual medicine. We need to find an academic home for sexual medicine. The strengths and the weaknesses of the biopsychosocial approach need to be negotiated. The strengths that it really is so broad, and its strength lies in its capacity to really look at people's health in a very real manner, a very authentic, broad manner, but its weakness and such, it's just spread so broadly that it's hard to be able to find a strong core for it to stand alone and strongly within the competitive academic environment. So we need a self-sustainable academic center. A model may be that of palliative care. The family medicine departments appear closest in spirit, and representatives are needed to liaise and actively negotiate with the different subspecialties to bring this together and negotiate a line through the curricula so that we are able to interact between all the different nodes, the undergraduate, the postgraduate, journals, other academic centers, examinations. And through this all, once again, I come back to the line that we started off with, and particular to South Africa, is that we need a formal and a very coherent strategy to unite and keep strong the connections between the private and the state sector. With that, I thank you with a picture of my hometown, Cape Town. And we are going to have a sexual medicine congress under SASHA next year in September, and perhaps hope to see you there. Thank you.